Is it possible to get rid of Hamas in the way that Israel is currently trying to do through airstrike bombardments and it is planned now an imminent ground invasion? Is that the best way to do it? Or is there a danger of radicalizing a lot more young Palestinians to the Hamas cause in the process?
Listen to this. We are going to remove Hamas from power. Remember my words, okay? And Hamas did not only bring the wrath of Israel over Gaza. Hamas brought the wrath of God. We are going to remove them from power, and we are going to persecute their leaders, and we are going to bring them to justice. And the world will witness their punishment. And everyone who take their side today in this state of confusion, thinking that this is a joke, I tell those people that you are going to regret taking the side of Hamas. You are going to regret taking the side of those criminals who are killing the Palestinian people.
Hello YouTube. This is Sadako24 here. Now you might have noticed that until recently I had quite a few videos up on my channel in which I discussed my thoughts on the ongoing Israel-Gaza war. Now I have since taken those videos down. And you might notice that I have since taken those videos down. I decided to take them off the channel. I felt they were out of place on the channel. As my channel is ostensibly a geeky channel. They also weren't particularly getting the views I hoped they would. But there were other reasons I took the videos down as well. The main one was that I realised that a lot of the videos I put up were very ill-informed about the whole situation. I've kind of been following some very dishonest sources in terms of being, my informed take was based on some very, very dishonest sources indeed. The big one being Ilan Journo's What Justice Demands, which he kind of makes the case that Israel is not the demonic evil in the Middle East that it's been made out to be. And much of his book is basically it's a defense. It's also a whitewash of Israel's crimes.
There's a deeper philosophic issue over and above the history and the politics. And that one, again, is part of the context that's dropped and deliberately dropped and evaded. And that is, yes, the UN voted for a partition. And you can cling to that if you're on the side of the Israelis and say, look, we were on the right side of this decision. And you can point fingers and say the Palestinians were not and so forth. And that's fine. But the deeper question is, should there have been any partition? Should there have been any state for Israel and any state for the Palestinians and the Arabs in the area? And that's the philosophic question. And I actually think the Israelis deserve to have a state because they were moving in the direction of a state that did and does now enable people to live in freedom and prosper and build and produce. Whereas what I think would have been expected of the Palestinian state is the opposite. It's what you see in all the neighboring regimes, which is they're authoritarian monarchies or theocracies, and not at all conducive to human life. We don't know what that would have looked like. Oh, actually, we do know, because the history, as we'll see, does point to what the Palestinian state looks like. But that's an important issue. What are the conditions? What are the moral premises that make your claim to statehood valid or invalid? The real question here is, what are the conditions that human beings need in order to live in a society? What is a good society? What is a just society? That's the principle that should govern who is entitled to a claim to statehood and for what kind of state. And that is completely ignored. And it's important for people looking at this map to ask themselves, why is that question not being put on the table? Why is it being pushed out of the way so that I'm led to think that the Palestinians are being victimized by this white growth on the map labeled Israel?
I took Israel's side in this conflict largely because October the 7th was so horrific, and it was also so reminiscent of the horrors we'd seen ISIS commit in Syria, and connected to that, the horrors that ISIS had inflicted on Europe and Britain as well. ISIS had inspired the Manchester Arena bombing, the Nice truck attack, the Sweden truck attack, the November Paris terrorist attack, the Brussels attack. It all seemed to stem from the same enemy we've been fighting all along. Same kind of evil, depraved enemy. And, I was very much of the mind that, the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's so complicated it almost, for some of us have, chosen our side long ago, and many have chosen the side of the Palestinians. Some have taken the side of Israel. Most of us are neutral and say, well, look, I don't know the history of the conflict well enough to make a judgment about whose side I should be on. They both got the grievances, I'm sure. Doesn't really concern me. Whichever side is right should win, I guess, but I'm not informed enough to know which side that is. If it was a simple injustice, shouldn't it be remedied right away, kind of thing? And then October the 7th happened. And that was when I think a lot of people just said, well, and yeah, myself included, said, well, I'm not neutral anymore. There's no way I can be neutral now, because what Hamas did on that day was just evil and depraved, and Israel simply has no choice but to retaliate massively. Israel has no choice but to go to war and take Hamas out of the equation completely. And so that's where I stood. I was kind of very much, I have to back Israel in this. Israel's going to go to war. It's inevitable whether I support Israel or not that they go to war, so all I can do is support the mission to eradicate Hamas from power. And hopefully at the end of it, there'll be no more wars. Hamas are the biggest liability to regional peace in the regional peace. And so once they're removed, hopefully we'll never get a war like this again. And this is kind of why, as I said, whenever there was whenever there were calls for a ceasefire, I was always kind of thinking, wait a minute, if there's a ceasefire, it just means going back to square one and starting this war all over again. It just means Hamas get a chance to start the war again. And that's all they'll do. They'll break the ceasefire. They can't be trusted. They're evil people.
Hamas has said that they will do this again and again. There is no way anyone can live beside that. What that looks like, what the defeat of Hamas looks like, we'll see. But a ceasefire is not the answer to that. And anyone who thinks otherwise should come here and learn something.
So that was my stance. And I got into a lot of arguments on Twitter about it. And frankly, a lot of the footage I saw of how pro-Palestinian activists conducted themselves, celebrating the October the 7th massacre, tearing down posters of hostages in such a vindictive way.
Are you from Hunter? Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. No. Don't worry about it. You will be all over the news. Don't worry about it. All over the news. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
Why are you tearing them down? Innocent people were kidnapped.
300 people killed in the hospital, bro. I was sent to every single firm. See your name? Look what they're doing. They're doing over these hostages signs. The children are dying in Israel. Look what they're doing.
It was like, I was thinking, I could still be on your side, and yet you're behaving in such a depraved and creepy way that you're making it impossible for me to take your side. All of you are. It seemed like all of them were doing this. It seemed like a huge numbers of people were doing this, and it just made no sense. It was just a sign of as I said, a darkness on the left, a nastiness on the left, a malignant malice on the left.
Why would you rip down posters of hostages? Why would you do that? What's the answer?
Because it is perpetuating a completely false narrative that the Israelis are the victims. It is more of a symbolic gesture because it is pathetic propaganda that they are putting into civilian areas that we are living in, and they're perpetuating this narrative to keep subconsciously programming people to think that Hamas are terrorists.
If you put up a poster to a missing dog in any Western city, that poster stays up. In city after city in America, posters of abducted Jewish children, including a 10-month-old baby, were put up and were ripped down by people who have been indoctrinated into hate of Jews. Nobody would rip down the poster of a missing dog, but from Dublin to Berkeley, they ripped down posters of abducted Jewish children. So no, I don't think there was very much care for that around the world. Let me put this to you, Douglas. Let me make two other very quick points. Firstly, you said what Hamas might do, as if it was some kind of hypothetical. Hamas showed what they do, what they want to do. It showed it on October the 7th, and its leadership, as I'm sure you very well know, said that they would like to repeat that again and again until they have got rid of every Jew. So, I don't know. I would trust Hamas's word on that rather than your interpretation of what you think they mean when they say that, and your generous interpretation of what you think that means. And finally, as for preventing a Palestinian state, it is nonsense that the Israelis have prevented a Palestinian state. They gave the Gazans a Palestinian state in 2005. They gave them a Palestinian state in 2005 when every Jewish person was ripped from their homes in the Gaza by IDF soldiers. And the Palestinian people were given a state. And what did they do? They voted in Hamas, who then killed their fellow Palestinians, never had another election, and used all the billions of dollars of taxpayer funds from the US, UK, and Europe to build terror tunnels and to enrich themselves so they could live the life of luxury in Qatar. Again and again, the reason there is not a Palestinian state is because the Palestinian leadership doesn't want one.
Okay, Douglas,
didn't want one in 1947, it preferred war, and it doesn't want one now.
You know, I did have a sick feeling in my stomach at the war operation, but I didn't see any way that Israel could turn back now. And months on, I still don't. However, when it came to arguing with a lot of these activists, I came to realize that this wasn't just the culture war anymore. This wasn't a case of, easily triggered SJWs, overreacting to nothing. This was people who were seeing genuinely anguishing, distressing images of the war in Gaza, and it was playing very much on their mental health and the mental well-being. And I realized that in pushing back against them, I was actually making things worse. I was appearing to be callous because I was hard-headed about this operation has to be done. There's no peace unless this gets done. Now, I say that I wasn't very well informed on the conflict, and here's why. What Justice Demands, the book What Justice Demands, makes barely any mention of just how horrific the founding of Israel was. How horrific the Israeli war for independence was. Like, there's barely a sentence devoted to the fact that there were some reported massacres in Deir Yassin and quite a few other towns. Well, he mentions one other town that saw a massacre. In totality, there were 24, at least, towns that saw massacres. And it was, regardless of what he says, it was an ethnic cleansing operation. The operation was, we want to drive the native Palestinians out of the land. Which is cruel enough, but there were massacres as well.
כבשנו טנטורה, תפסנו הרבה ערבים, אספנו אותם. זה סיפור מאוד יופי. היה איזה 15-20, שמרנו עליהם, פתאום בא אחד עם כובע אוסטרלי, יש לו אקדח, הוא צועק בערבית, קומו, הם קמו. הוא ניגש קרוב, ככה מסתכל. הולך צד אחר, הוא מוצא את האקדח, טרח, הרג את כולם. אותי זה זעזע. דם קר, כן? אני אותו לא שאלתי, אני שאלתי. כאלה שידעו, למה זה? אין לך מושג כמה יהודים אלה הרגו. אין לך מושג. נגמר.
There was a particularly horrific massacre in Tantura, which for a long time Israel didn't even talk about. It was kind of hushed up. But it happened. And there are even soldiers there who will talk about it. And quite recently, a documentary about it came out in which the soldiers were interviewed describing the massacre they committed.
כשהגדוד פוסע, אויב תחתיו קורע. כפריו נופלים לבחורים שלל, קקון וגם טנטורה, הגדוד יפעל במרץ, ישמיד אויב כשרץ. השתוללו בטנטורה, זה היה משהו נורא. טנטורה היה כפר עשיר, בתים יפים, גרים כמו אירופאים, אתה יודע, וגם אנשים היו לבושות ויפה, וזה באמת היה כפר... אחד אנס שם איזה ילדה בת 16, משהו כזה. אתה מבין? אבל זה מכוער מאוד, היה לנו בחור אחד, הוא נפטר, הוא היה פרא אדם, הוא לקח פשוט מאוד, ורצח אותם בתוך המכלאות. בתוך המכלאות, הם היו במכלאות, אתה יודע, חוטי ברזל כאלה, עגולים כאלה, אספו כל הגברים. הם יושבים שם, כל העם, על הרצפה, ובא מישהו, ולוקח תת מקלע, ומתחיל זה, מחליף מחסנית, מה אתה חושב זה? אבל אנחנו לא היינו כאלה. הוא היה יוצא דופן, הבחור הזה, כן, מה שהוא עשה. והשתיקו את הדבר הזה, והיו חבר'ה שלקחו את הלוויורים, ורדפו אחרי חבר'ה ושרפו אותם. זה היה משהו זוועתי, וזה אסור לספר, אני לא אדבר על זה, כי זה יכול להיות סקנדל שלם מהעניין הזה. אני לא רוצה לדבר על זה, וזהו. אבל זה היה, מה לעשות, זה היה.
I took my time, clips of this documentary was shown during the, the clashes on Twitter, people kind of bring it up and saying, yeah, this is Israel's past crimes. This is kind of, there is a reason why a lot of Palestinian activists say that, the Nakba was our October the 7th. It was the October the 7th for the Palestinians. And watching Tantura, I realized that they were right. I saw a massacre in that, these men, soldiers, they described it very vividly. It's like they had a flashback to the event and they described all the details, and described, we gathered these villagers, they were Arabs, we put them in behind barbed wire, they were unarmed, they were defenseless. Some head case general came over and decided to just shoot them all dead, just machine gun them. It was merciless. It was just cruel. It was just they had such a dehumanized view of the Arabs, of the Palestinians, and just murdered them cruelly. It is one of the most disturbing documentaries I've ever seen, frankly. And it described how they put all the victims in a mass grave, buried it, and it's now been turned into a car lot on the coast. There's almost nothing left of Tantura as a village anymore. It was very upsetting to watch, and it certainly upset my worldview. Because, here I was saying, that October the 7th justifies how Israel responds. And yet, here was, the founding fathers of Israel doing, essentially, a massacre just as evil as October the 7th. back in 1948, and they were never punished for it. They got away with it. They won the war. Palestinians never saw justice for that. They were driven from the land, carried the memories of that horrible day for the rest of their lives. So it caused a major crisis of conviction for me. It was like, I wondered if I'd backed the wrong side. Or rather, it upset kind of my moral grounding in this of, I mean, it didn't make Hamas any less evil as far as I was concerned. But it meant that I couldn't just say that. I had to think very hard about why there was a reason to exonerate Israel's past crimes whilst advocating for eradicating Hamas for its present crimes. Because this is a very dark chapter in Israeli history, and so I was unsure where my convictions lay anymore.
There were Arabs standing between Lud and Ramle and crying they want to get back to their homes, and I could do nothing. And I felt very strongly about it because I saw them standing there, no shoes, and now they have to start walking and looking for someplace else. Then came the night, and at night, I don't know how many, 15 or 16 or maybe 10, I can't remember, trucks full of people that just came on the ship from the Holocaust. And they took over the town in 5 minutes. And so the whole tragedy was there in one moment. Here are the Arabs who used to live there, and here people who come from the Auschwitz and Majdanek and all that. And they won, they took the city. And the Arabs had to go to Nablus and to Jenin and it's not that it's right or wrong, but it's just a fact.
Now, why were the Palestinians expelled? Why was there this ethnic cleansing policy? Well, there are two schools of thought. One is that was always the agenda, that was always kind of, that was always the Zionist endgame. And it was a kind of opportunism that fell into the lap of the Zionists when World War II happened and the British mandate kind of ended. Now they could push for ownership of what was essentially the Jewish Holy Land. The other school of thought, of course, is that it was down to Arab. There was Arabs who revolted, rebelled. They rebelled to the presence of the Jews. And it got to the point where it was deemed necessary to evacuate villages of people because, villages were the means through which rebels operated. Whisper networks, word of mouth. The idea was if we remove them, then there's no threats to us anymore. And besides, there was the whole question of the population of, the incoming refugees from Europe who needed a home.
The whole idea of Zionism, of the creation of a Jewish state, was deeply unpopular in Europe and among most European Jews before 1939. Very few of them were persuaded of it. They thought it was a bad idea. They could see the problems of moving Jews into an area which was already inhabited by Arabs. There was already a large Jewish settlement in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, but not a nation. But after the death camps were opened in 1945, even the most obdurate opponents of the Zionist program of creating a Jewish state in the Middle East, even they gave up. They said there has to be somewhere to go. Most people don't know the record of the civilized nations of the world in the period before 1939. They don't know how they simply closed their doors to Jewish refugees from Nazi persecution. Even worse, they don't know that Britain was one of the most foremost in closing those doors, because Britain controlled migration to what was then its colonial possession, the Palestine Mandate. And in 1939, having promised to create a national home for the Jews, pretty much ended Jewish migration to that part of the world. 1939, this was after the terrible events of what most people will have heard of, Kristallnacht, in November 1938, when the German government openly sponsored a murderous pogrom against the Jews of Germany. You could not have been in any doubt in May 1939, when we started shutting down Jewish migration to Palestine, you could not have been in any doubt of the dangers of the Jews of Europe from Nazi Germany, and yet we closed it. And it's the most extraordinary event. But this was general at the time. And so but people changed their minds. And so that is, Israel doesn't exist for any other reason than that. Millions of people, some Jewish, many not, recognized that Jews had in future to have somewhere to go if the persecution started again. That's why it's there. It's there because of persecution. But it's opposed for the same reason that it's there.
This Zionist idea and having a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, it was partly religious. It was partly, an idea, a pragmatic idea for how, the best way for the Jewish people to be protected from the various pogroms that have been throughout history, the anti-Semitism that have been throughout history, was to set up their own state where they wouldn't be persecuted by anti-Semites anymore. And anti-Semitism was quite on the rise in Russia at the time. Then, of course, it started to happen in Europe as well. Like, Hitler was notoriously anti-Semitic, but he was anti-Semitic at a time when it was fashionable in German society to be anti-Semitic. It was a fashionable view to have. Now the problem is, of course, that Britain had a mandate for Palestine. They'd kind of mandated the area of Palestine, which meant that it was vulnerable to predators. And Zionism was quite a predatory worldview, I suppose. It saw an opportunity here to exploit the land, exploit the powerlessness of the native population, who were under a British mandate. Said, okay, well, we can take this land. The way it's kind of paid for us to take over. Now, Peter Hitchens has said that actually Zionism was a very unpopular idea at the time. It was a very unpopular notion. Before, the rise of Hitler and Nazism. And so basically the ambitions to, create a Jewish state, it probably would have been a pipe dream, a hollow promise by the British, because, the British was kind of promising Palestine to the Jews, but they also promising it to the Arabs. Because this is after World War One, and the idea was that they would kind of, as a reward to the Arabs for their part in helping defeat the Turks, they'd be given kind of, independent sovereignty over Palestine and Transjordan. And this kind of clashed with the agreement to set up a state with, set up a Jewish state, set up Israel. Now, so this probably would have been a pipe dream. It probably might never have happened if it wasn't for the fact that various events caused Israel to go from being a pipe dream to a kind of an existential necessity for the Jews. There was, of course, Hitler and the Holocaust. That was the main reason. But before we even get into that, there was the Russian Revolution, the communist revolution in Russia that deposed the Tsar of Russia just at a point where Russia were our allies in World War One. As a result of the communist coup, the new communist leadership began to whistleblow. They began to dig into the archives of Britain's secret treaties and made them public. And it made public the fact that Britain had offered a mandate to the Jews and to the Arabs in Palestine. So this caused major disillusionment, and the Arabs felt that the Palestinian state was under threat from the Jews, and so that's when opinion turned against the Jews in Palestine, and that's when attacks began. That's when this harmonious coexistence kind of turned sour, and the Arabs became more hostile, more violent. There was more outbreaks of violence, and as a result of the increase of violence, the Jews in Palestine started demanding, the rights to their own army, their own militias, and the Jews were granted a militia, but they also breakaway militias that were illegal and were basically just terrorists. The Arabs formed their guerrilla armies as well, and they started to demand, an end to any further Jewish immigration to Palestine. Just at a point when, there was a major refugee crisis because of the Nazis. There was a major refugee crisis of Jewish immigration to escape Europe because of the rise of Nazism. So the Arabs, committed terrorism to compel Britain to turn off the migration, to block the migration, to compel Britain to block the migration. Then there'd be Jewish terrorism targeted the British to coerce Britain into resuming the migration and getting their people to safety in Palestine. The situation became harder and harder to control. Britain was clearly going to lose its mandate completely. I mean, the ideal scenario would be if the Jews were allocated a small patch of land and the rest of the area was either under British mandate or largely under Arab rule. But that didn't come to fruition. Most of the partition plans didn't come to fruition, and it was eventually decided that there had to be partition because there was just too much bad blood between the two sides. And eventually, so it was kind of an existential necessity that the Jews needed their homeland because it was, they needed a safe zone. They needed somewhere they could take refuge after the Holocaust. There was a certain arrogance to the Zionist leaders who felt that it would be no big deal to kick the Arabs out of the land because they, well, look, the Arabs, most of the region speaks Arabic. They'll be able to resettle elsewhere easily. I mean, I have a hard time defending it still. I don't think you really can defend it, except to say that it was awful. It was an awful situation, and so much was awful all round. There's a reason why there are some people on the left who would say that, Israel just shouldn't exist. It should never have been created. And, looking into the horrors of the Nakba, there is a part of me that very strongly agrees. But the problem is, the Nakba shouldn't have happened in the same way that the Holocaust shouldn't have happened. If the Holocaust had not happened, the Nakba probably wouldn't have happened. It's one evil deed precedes the other. I suppose the best defense you could say is that if you look at the surrounding region of the Middle East, there were Jewish communities in Yemen and Iraq who suffered their Nakbas as well. There was a Nakba against the Jews as well in Yemen and Iraq at the time. There were pogroms, there was forced evictions. unlike the Palestinians, the Jewish refugees from those countries could settle in Israel. They had a country a homeland to retreat to. Whereas the Palestinians, it was difficult for them. So much of the life they built was in the villages that they were expelled from, and those villages were often demolished.
Have you found that the Palestinians here want to integrate with the Syrians at all?
Oh, no, never. They don't want, not here or neither in Lebanon or in Jordan, never. No, because they want to stay as a whole, as a Palestinian. They call themselves those who go back, Al-Aidun in Arabic.
When they migrated to Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, quite often they were never quite able to integrate into the society as a whole. Quite often they did become radicalized into the PLO movement, which offered them the promise that they could fight their way to the return. And the PLO developed from that into this very nasty mafiosi that actually thought of themselves as above the law and, frankly, above the laws of the lands, Jordan and Lebanon that had taken them in the first place. And that's why there was a horrific civil war in Lebanon, because the PLO tried to overthrow the Lebanese government. And it's the same with similar happened in Jordan. There's a reason why people are kind of pointing to, well, why don't the Arab nations, the surrounding Arab nations, take the Palestinians in? And it's largely because whenever they have in the past, they've ended up inheriting, the terrorist menace of the PLO, or Hamas, which is far worse than the PLO.
One thing that we want to make very clear is that never again will there be a return to the situation that existed along our northern border prior to June of 1982. In other words, we will not allow the development of a terrorist infrastructure, be it Shiite or Palestinians. That's of no difference to us, along the border that could endanger the life of our northern border settlements.
I mean, I think part of the reason why it's taken me so long to be on the side of the Palestinians in anything is because much of what I'd seen was, of the PLO was all after the fact of the Nakba. It was, there were documentaries about the PLO terrorism back in the 70s in which they actually showed this Jewish school which had an air raid bunker.
It was here in 1974 that Palestinian terrorists carried out an horrific attack which caused the deaths of 20 Israeli children. The target of the attack was the village school. The school still carries protective grills and the scars of gunfire. In the 70s and early 80s, villages like this were subjected to Palestinian rocket fire. The Israeli government decided that bunkers were not enough.
I just couldn't stomach the idea of that as justified in any way, regardless of any liberation struggle, supposedly, regardless of the grievance. And this is like the PLO. They were kind of the more secular terrorists compared to the Islamic threat that we have suffered since. But it made it very difficult to understand why the Israelis should grant them any peace deal at all, really. And yet Israel did work on a peace deal with the PLO eventually in the 80s and 90s. This is what I mean when I say it's complicated. This is why people feel it's complicated, because you can look at both sides of this and see both sides having a history of doing things that are utterly indefensible, utterly immoral, utterly evil, in fact. I mean, I don't know what Israeli culture would have been like back in the 1940s or 50s. I know that the military culture was, frankly, very fascistic. Very racist, very, very nasty. But I'm not sure the society was like that. And in fact, these days, it seems to me that Israeli society is very westernized indeed. And with that has come a certain, liberal attitudes. I mean, sure, there are some, utterly insane messianic Zionists in Israel, who are just as volatile and unreasonable and unhinged as the Muslim counterparts. Particularly when it comes to, the settlers in the West Bank who are just vile. I mean, my mum visited the West Bank back in the mid 2000s, and she said, she encountered the settlers and they were so violent. They were basically scallies. They're basically just, really nasty, thuggish, really, really horrid people, and they had a certain privilege to attack the Palestinians, who were kind of second-class citizens there. Melanie Phillips, although she is a Zionist, and I'm very, very skeptical of her positions in a lot of ways, she has rightly said that the UN is vindictive. The UN allows for vindictiveness. It allows for countries to pursue personal vendettas. And that there's a reason why there are more resolutions against Israel than there are against Korea or Syria, which is laughable, frankly. It should not be the case. Now, granted, the UN at the beginning, when the UN was a young body, it was right when the Nakba was happening, and the UN were pretty useless back then, and they didn't really do much to hold back Israel's conduct. And it seems it's possible, I suppose you could say, that their vindictiveness since has almost been an attempt to overcorrect for that. You could almost say that, but I think there's more to it than that. I think it's more a case that as the Arab states have gotten, and the Islamic states, and Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and all these other nations have gotten more of a say on the UN, they've had more, and South Africa as well, obviously, and Brazil. They've been able to push forward their vendettas against Israel in excess of every other country that should be on the UN's shit list, but for some reason isn't.
We are looking into Syria, site of just the worst civil war imaginable. Syrians who are wounded or in need of medical attention have been getting medical attention from the Israelis.
Sometimes they're wounded and sometimes those are sick women or children. I cannot imagine how they feel.
Yeah.
Sometimes they come and they're just so scared and you can barely get them talk. And sometimes they say toda, thank you in Hebrew. That's
for
in
a
my
Syrian
language.
to thank you in Hebrew is pretty special.
Yes.
Now, Israel has faced a lot of UN resolutions. And I would venture that that's why, frankly, I would say there is a reason why, that is part of the reason why Israel has never committed. I do think the Nakba is the most evil thing that Israel ever did. And there's probably good reason why it has never been able to be that evil again, which is because it's so, punitively penalized by the UN. And in some ways it has compelled Israel to adopt more good behavior, if you know what I mean. It's kind of, made it more of a pride of principle that the IDF is supposed to be the most moral army in the world. Now, personally, I don't think there's any such thing as the most moral army in the world, but there is at least the idea that the IDF is supposed to adhere to the letter of the, being the most moral army in the world, of, be chivalrous, warn civilians in advance that we're going to attack, a Hamas base, those kind of things. And, I don't think, that the IDF is perfect, certainly. It's like any army, you're going to get, soldiers who are trigger happy. You're going to get combat situations in which, people just shoot first and ask questions later, especially when you're being unnerved by an enemy like Hamas.
In December 1992, the militant group Hamas kidnapped an Israeli border guard and stabbed him to death. The Israeli response was overwhelming. They arrested 415 members of Hamas, put them on buses, and took them to the top of a bleak mountain in southern Lebanon. They left them there and refused to allow any humanitarian aid through. But the Israelis had dumped the Hamas militants in an area controlled by Hezbollah. They spent 6 months there, and during that time they learnt from Hezbollah how powerful suicide bombing could be. Hezbollah told them how they had used it to force the Israelis out of Beirut and back to the border. The first sign that the idea had spread to Hamas was when a group of the deportees marched in protest towards the Israeli border, dressed as martyrs, as the Israelis shelled them. But it soon became more than just theatre. Hamas began a wave of suicide attacks in Israel.
Just before 9, at the height of Tel Aviv's rush hour, the bomb ripped apart a commuter bus. An amateur cameraman recorded the scene in the moments afterwards as a dazed woman was helped out of the smouldering wreckage.
I didn't want to believe that under my house there is a bomb. And when I realized it's a bomb, I started to cry because it was the first time I saw it in Tel Aviv.
Hamas kept sending the bombers into Israel, sometimes day after day. The horror overwhelmed Israeli society, and it completely destroyed the ability of politics to solve the Palestinian crisis. Instead, in the Israeli election of 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu took power. He turned against the peace process, which was exactly what Hamas wanted. And from then on, the two sides became locked together in ever more horrific cycles of violence. The human bomb had destroyed the very thing that President Assad had first wanted, a real political solution to the Palestinian question.
It was just after 1 o'clock and the market was full of shoppers. Streams of ambulances came to carry away the dead and the injured. It was a place of appalling suffering. But even with the first grief came the immediate political impact on the peace process.
It's impossible. This moment it will be the end, must be the end of this bloody peace process.
So where did that leave me, really? Well, it's left me with the position that there are worse states in the Middle East than Israel, definitely. And the point is that Israel was coming close to a good deal with the Saudis and with the region. Things were going well for the region, and that's the only reason, as I can see it, that Hamas attacked. It wasn't to do with any grievances. They just wanted to screw a peace deal.
The people of Israel demand, all right-thinking people demand that this genocidal bunch of murderers are obliterated from the face of the earth. And believe you me, it will happen. Now, Israel will always put their hand out one hand out to peace. That is in our nature. We wish to live in peace in this region. We, of course, that one of the reasons why this entire terrible thing has happened is because we were getting closer peace, particularly with Saudi Arabia. We knew that the genocidal murderers in Hamas and in Iran, their principal funders, didn't want that to happen, which is why they launched this attack. But we will always try our hardest for peace. But in the words of King David, there is a time for peace and a time for war. And right now, it's time to obliterate Hamas.
Ever since they were formed, they've done nothing but sabotage the peace process with intifadas, suicide bombing campaigns. Now you can argue, well, they were protesting against an unfair peace deal, but they can only do it so often before I start to, just say, well, look, I don't see any reason to have any sympathy for them. They're just troublemakers. They're just scum. And they're a horrific death cult as well, which is kind of why Israel is in a pickle in terms of how to remove them and deal with the populations that they've largely brainwashed into being very much like their death cult. Very much part of that death cult. I mean, that is not what the Palestinians were back in 1948, sadly. By all accounts, they weren't.
It's very important to note that Israel pulled out of Gaza completely, unilaterally in 2005. They uprooted all the Jewish citizens who used to live in Gaza. All of them. All of them were taken out forcefully. After 2005, there was no Jew alive or dead in Gaza. They even take out the graves of the Jewish people because they didn't know what is going to happen to the graves. And this was a test case to see how a self-governing Gaza would look like. Gaza is a very fertile land. They had greenhouses that used to export flowers to all of Europe. And the hope in Israel was that we're hoping that Gaza can become the Singapore of the Middle East, this tiny country that has this very good economy with all the greenhouses, and they have the most beautiful beaches in the region, and they can go and fish, they can build, we're going to help them in tech. This is our path for peace. Days after the Jews, left Gaza, Hamas went and burned out all the greenhouses. They burned everything to the ground because this was the Jews' greenhouses before.
Hamas happily swims in the ocean of Gaza because the people want it so. And if you doubt me, watch the celebratory videos, if you're sick enough to find them. Watch the celebratory videos of women, specifically women, welcoming back these jihadists with the captured hostages, the captured, mutilated, tortured hostages, with celebratory cries. The average, naive, shielded Western mind cannot comprehend this, because most people have never beheld a jihadist element up close. They certainly have never beheld a Palestinian jihadist element up close. There is no diplomacy that can be entertained with evil. It must be crushed. Ultimately, crushed.
For a while, I just came to the conclusion that maybe it's nothing really to do with me. Maybe I should just, accept that it's a conflict I don't know enough about to really take a side in. Other than, Hamas are obviously the worst, but, Israel are not saints either. But there's a problem I kept coming to, which is that every time I thought I kind of saw a bit more of the Palestinian side of things, and was drawn more to the Palestinian side of things, I'd find myself drawn to one of the various Palestinian activists, and be confronted very quickly with the fact that a lot of them are very, very deranged, creepy scumbags indeed. A lot of them are. Miko Peled was Miko Peled was one of the first ones I came across. He's allegedly the son of he was the son of a general in the IDF, and apparently he had this disillusioning realization about the dark history of Israel and about the Nakba and about the oppression of the Palestinians. And after I'd watched Tantora, I suppose I was willing to believe his account. Much of it did seem credible. Until he started to get to the period where Hamas came on the scene, and he kept on referring to them as a resistance group continually. And that's when I realized this guy was scummy. And whenever I've seen him argue with people about this, I've noticed that he's deranged and he's someone who just loves to be very vituperate and very nasty. And there's just something very, very strange and deranged about him.
Please, or I'll send you out.
Well, he's
Just a minute, or I'll send you out.
You support the massacre.
This is never going to achieve a ceasefire, and you know that. Because you are
it
not
will.
going
Of
to
course it will.
dictate to Britain or America.
A resistance
what we should do.
organization responds to oppression.
They are terrorists, not a resistance organization.
No.
They started
No,
this.
no.
He thinks rape is resistance.
Do
No.
you think
No.
paedophilia
Do
and
you
cutting, mutilating people is
No.
resistance? Yes,
the
you do.
resistance the resistance is to the Israeli oppression. Hamas was established.
It's a resistance.
Dash, will you
October 7th was resistance.
Will you stop it a minute?
Is a response to violence, is a response to oppression, is a response to the occupation, is a response to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Israel and by the Zionist movement, which seems to me that you support.
You know, he's just a very, very hateful individual indeed. And he's someone who just seems to love being argumentative. I think the guy has genuinely got some kind of a personality disorder. Probably narcissism. You know, this need to be just hateful and nasty is just... So, you know, it's like every time I think I'm drawn more to the Palestinian side of things, I encounter one of their activists and realise that a lot of them are just utter scum as people. And I'm reminded that, which, you know, I keep forgetting it. And that's the irony, really, is that, you know, for much of the beginning of this war, I was kind of arguing that, you know, we shouldn't turn into a witch hunt and just declare every Palestinian activist some kind of anti-Semite. You know, I did say, you know, well, look, you know, Charlotte Church has taken the side of Palestine. Doesn't mean she's anti-Semitic. Doesn't mean she's pro-Hamas. Same with Greta Thunberg. I said, you know, there's a danger of this turning into a witch hunt where we're just saying that everyone who's pro-Palestine is anti-Semitic. But the irony is that I gradually realised that I was worrying about the wrong side in this. The witch hunt, the real witch hunt, is being done by the left, by the pro-Palestine left, who have started to target Jewish businesses. They've started to try and defund, you know, businesses that have anything to do with Israel. They are openly saying they want to bankrupt Israel. They want to forbid any arms sales to Israel, despite the fact that, you know, Israel needs to get this war finished, and Israel is facing, you know, it's a very hostile region. Israel is facing, you know, Iran, the Houthis, you know, a lot of these hostile regimes surrounding it. You know, do you really want Israel to be defenseless against them? Do you want them to be defenseless against Hamas when we saw what Hamas could do in a day?
Is everybody who signed the letter then, given what you've just said, against the existence of Israel because of how it came about? Or are you interested in some kind of peaceful coexistence? I mean, I know it seems far away at the moment.
I don't think there's anything in the letter which says anything along those lines.
No, that's why I'm asking you, is that because what you've just said there suggests that they just shouldn't be there.
That's your reading. What I'm saying is that
is it wrong?
Israel's more than 7 decades old regime of apartheid and occupation and settler colonialism should be dismantled. That's my view.
And what happens to Israelis in that dismantling?
I probably should say that if there's a turnaround on my opinion on Tantora and comparing it to October the 7th, I was willing to say it sounded as though it was evil, but it sounded as though the two deeds were just as evil, but I have not watched the October the 7th footage. I can't watch the October the 7th footage. There's no way. I've seen far too many horrific images in this war as it is. Things I never want to see again. I've had enough breakdowns during this as it is. But Douglas Murray has seen the footage, and he said, it's worse than any footage I've ever seen anywhere else.
I was invited to see the raw footage from the 7th of October massacres, and I've seen quite a lot in war zones I've covered, in the flesh as well as in sometimes being shown video of atrocities. I think what I saw yesterday is by some margin worse than anything I've seen before. And I've been in Nigerian villages when a suicide bomber goes into the church on a Sunday and blows everyone up. And then people chase people through the fields shooting them. I've seen enough exit wounds from children's bodies. But the footage of the 7th of October is a level of depravity that, yes, not even the Nazis did. Because the whole time they're massacring, and I think the film was we saw about 10% of all the bodies that Hamas, the people that Hamas killed that day. Throughout the whole thing, the Hamas fighters are in a state of utter elation. Utter elation.
Were the Nazis in a state of utter elation as they gassed the Jews?
Even the descriptions of the Einsatzgruppen, who were shooting Jews in the back of the head in trenches, to fall into trenches, grave pits that they'd made the Jews dig for themselves. Even when you read the accounts, both from the very, very few survivors and from those who witnessed it and those who partook in it, say that the soldiers had to actually be, weirdly enough, protected from their acts by getting incredibly drunk in the evenings and trying to forget what they'd been made to do. The Hamas terrorists are utterly elated and delighted by what they're doing. I said this yesterday, but I really don't want to hear Allahu Akbar shouted again on my streets. It's a war cry. The Hamas terrorists are shouting Allahu Akbar all the way through, as they are using a shovel to decapitate a young man. With every blow of the shovel, they shout Allahu Akbar. When they go in to rape and murder all these young women in a room, they're shouting Allahu Akbar the whole time. When they find a young woman hiding under a table, pretending to be dead, and they realize she's alive, and they begin killing her, they're shouting Allahu Akbar all the time. And they're so elated. And they phone home. We've got the telephone calls now. They phone home. One disgusting young Hamas guy shouts from the phone of one of his victims, his father in Gaza, saying, "I have killed with my own hands 10 Jews. Your son has killed 10 Jews." And the mother is put on the phone and they're all shouting Allahu Akbar and they're so proud of him.
And it's like, it seems that the left do not care about rendering Israel defenseless against this threat again and again.
Let me go to Norman Finkelstein. Norman, the question I would have for you is this. Do you accept that Hamas need to be removed from power in Gaza?
I would say that the preeminent, I would say that the preeminent question at the present moment ought to be do I accept the fact that the Israeli government ought to be removed from power. And should Hamas remain in power, I think that the Palestinian people should be able to determine their own future and determine their leadership.
There's all this talk about ending the IDF, ending Israel's military, ending Israel's economy. You know, the left seem to be delighting in this. It's positively deranged.
Calling Hamas a terrorist organization is ridiculous, racist, and plays into genocidal propaganda that is flooding our media and that we should be doing everything possible to combat.
I support the right of Palestinians to resist occupation, including through Hamas, the armed wing of the unified Palestinian resistance.
As an Arab, asking with this context to condemn Hamas is very anti-Arab racist.
The notion that this was a massacre of Jews is a fabricated narrative. Many of those killed on October 7th,
Thank you, ma'am. Your time is up.
Including children, were killed by the IDF. An amendment condemning Hamas is bald propaganda meant to...
Thank you. Your time is up.
To hear them complain about Hamas violence is like listening to a wife-beater complain when his wife finally stands up and fights back.
Question. Did anyone else notice that those who oppose this resolution are old white supremacists?
There's been a lot of atrocity propaganda ranging from claims of beheaded babies to mass rape.
Hamas is not a terrorist organization just because the U.S. and Israel deems it so. Hamas is a resistance organization that is fighting for the liberation of Palestinian people and their land.
You know, and they want, South Africa to prosecute this genocide case, this joke of a genocide case from a country that does not even recognize Hamas as a terrorist group.
Hamas is a terrorist organization.
South Africa, like many other countries in the South, has not declared Hamas as a terrorist organization. That does not mean we condone what Hamas has done. The fact that other jurisdictions have declared them a terrorist organization does not mean that we should do the same.
And does not even recognize the fact that half of the terrible, humanitarian conditions in Gaza, the humanitarian crisis, is down to the fact that Hamas wasted the country's aid money on these stupid rockets and tunnels.
Poverty in the Gaza Strip should go directly attributable to Hamas. Gaza should look like Monaco with the amount of aid which has been pouring into that strip. The poor people living in Gaza are poor because of Hamas. They have problems with their water supply because water pipes, which were donated by the international community, were dug up to be used as missiles to fire at my people.
So it was when I watched the South Africa case, I think I was like, okay, I guess I've got to hear them out. Are they making the case right? Is it true? Is it true that Israel is guilty now? And the more I listened to the case, ostensibly with what I thought was an open mind, I realized, no, they're not. They're just being vindictive. They are giving a complete pass to Hamas and laying the blame entirely on Israel for the horrific state of this war and the horrific state of this humanitarian crisis that Hamas just doesn't care about preventing. And we saw UNRWA exposed as well. Saw just how the UN has been horrifically compromised, horrifically corrupted by Hamas. And I had no idea. I'd always thought the UN was an incompetent organization, but a well-meaning one all the same. I didn't realize how corrupt it was, how in bed with Hamas it was. But now I do know, and that's kind of horrifying.
Damage to civilian structures is another fact claimed by South Africa as evidence of genocide. But South Africa does not consider the sheer extent to which Hamas uses ostensibly civilian structures for military purposes. Houses, schools, mosques, UN facilities, and shelters are all abused for military purposes by Hamas, including as rocket launching sites. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels dug by Hamas under populated areas in Gaza often cause structures above to collapse. In the slides before you, you can see a militant priming projectiles for launch on IDF forces in Gaza. You can see the holes in the residential house to hide and launch them. Here, you can see projectiles discovered underneath a bed in a child's bedroom. Here, a rocket being fired from a school. The launch site is circled in red. Here you can see firing from a UN school. You can see the letters UN on the roof, and the fire is circled in red. And here, long-range rocket launchers hidden inside a Scouts Club building. Finally, you can see part of a tunnel that runs for 4 kilometers, including nearby the Erez crossing, which is adjacent to Israel. Gaza's infrastructure has certainly been harmed during the conflict. However, South Africa would have the court believe that Israel is deliberately and unlawfully destroying homes without cause, but harm caused to lawful military objectives and harm caused as a result of Hamas's actions is not evidence of genocide.
And it all seemed to kind of come together to me as a realization that this was a deranged vendetta the left had that just wanted Israel gone. It wanted Hamas to win. They didn't care about the atrocities on October the 7th. They delighted in them. And up until this point, people kind of pointed out the behavior of Hamas were always being scoffed at. It's laughable that Israel is going to be the victim here when it's inflicting these atrocities.
The cause of this latest battle is 3,000 missiles aimed into the population centers of Israel, attempting to murder as many Jews as possible. If there were no Hamas missiles, there'd be no Israeli retaliation that's simply designed to protect the citizens of Israel.
Max, let's talk about that Hamas charter, which features that introductory quote by Imam Hassan al-Banna, Israel will rise and will remain erect until Islam eliminates it. And as it had eliminated its predecessors, how can Israel negotiate with an organization that doesn't recognize its right to exist?
Well, that charter has been in publication for decades. Hamas has repeatedly offered to negotiate and has negotiated. They negotiated the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap. I'm not a spokesman for Hamas, and I'm not going to defend their political goals. What we're talking about here is a ghettoized population that's being completely decimated before our eyes, entire families being wiped out. And if you want to talk about charters, look at the Likud charter, which I presume Morton supports, which calls for the entire Jewish state control over all of the West Bank. It doesn't even recognize the existence of Palestinians. This charter has been carried out. It's being carried out before our eyes, unlike the Hamas charter. Morton mentioned rockets from Hamas. They have killed less than 13 people in the last decade. How many Palestinians ghettoized in the Gaza Strip have been slaughtered in this campaign of ghetto cleansing by the Israeli Air Force? How many? We're talking about over 1,300 in just the course of less than 2 weeks, and I doubt that Morton will condemn this or even put a limit on the amount of civilian casualties that he will be able to tolerate. We've seen this from no Jewish establishment leaders in the U.S., no moral limits, because they're Palestinians, they're people you have denigrated as Nazis. You've denigrated an entire population as Nazis. My sympathy is with the people who are enduring this one-sided slaughter. The background for this slaughter, as you've pointed out, is the Gaza withdrawal. The Gaza withdrawal enabled the siege of the Gaza Strip, in which Israel banned everything from cardamom to cinnamon to size A2 paper. Size A2 paper was banned into the Gaza Strip. What were they going to do? Make terrorist paper airplanes? Give me a break.
I didn't realize until now that the reason why they scoffed at it wasn't because Hamas were no threat to Israel. We now know that they never cared, that they were happy to see Hamas deliver a horrific blow to Israeli society. And, the Nakba was horrible because of what happened to the civilians. October the 7th was horrific because of what happened to the civilians, except the left don't care. The left think that the civilians are guilty and they deserve what they got. They think that Israel deserves everything it gets if it loses. They want Israel to lose. And if Israel isn't losing to Hamas, they want to make sure they do. They want to make sure that Israel are prosecuted, disarmed, defunded. It's literally the case where the cancel mobs of the left have now graduated from trying to cancel people to trying to cancel countries. They want to cancel Israel.
As the war on Gaza has unfolded over the past 100 days, one of the shocking things that we have seen is Israelis flying in from all over the globe to join the IDF. Whilst countries like South Africa offered warnings against their citizens in travelling to Palestine and joining the massacre on the Gaza Strip, countries like the UK and France have seen sometimes near thousands of their citizens flying off to join the IDF. This brings us to the case of Levi Simon. Levi Simon is one of the many British Israelis who has taken off to go and fight for the IDF.
We're talking about Gaza. We're talking about Levi Simon, that terrorist that's come back from, Gaza.
A British charity called the Boys Club in northwest London was set to host a British-Israeli dual national called Levi Simon. You may know him from this clip.
Inside of Gaza. Exotic laundry that you...
And that clip.
Gaza waving an Israeli flag in one of their schools where they teach terrorism, so...
But the event was cancelled, and here are some of the interesting things that we saw outside the venue.
That this so-called charity have the audacity to invite a British man who glorified his participation in the genocide of Gaza.
The championing on the Houthis to sink, our supply ships, supply ships the world over. And the irony is, the left will always say, well, back in 2003 when we were going to go to war with Iraq, there were people on the left who say that, well, we always warned that, this war will cause destabilization in the region, it will make things worse. And, I'm not a fan of Saddam Hussein as a dictator, but I think removing him is going to make things worse.
Should Hamas remain in power?
If I could wave a magic wand, then no, obviously there'd be an independent, let me finish. There'd be an independent Palestine, free of Israeli rule, with a secular democratic movement in power. The difference
I agree with you.
When you courageously stood against the Iraq war, and you were courageous for doing so, what was the argument put against you? That you wanted to keep Saddam Hussein in power even though he gassed his own people, the Kurds, and committed genocide, many would argue, that he had invaded his neighbour, and that he had massacred the Shia when they rose up in 1991. Now, your argument against that was that what could happen next would be far, far worse. And you were right.
Many of them were vindicated. Once Saddam was removed from power, things did get worse. It did destabilise the region majorly, and we are suffering the brunt of that still. Same as we're suffering the brunt of destabilising Libya. That's why we've got the refugee problem we do. It's why there's been the rise of ISIS in both Iraq, Syria, and Libya. So the left seem to say, it doesn't matter if you're as brutal a dictator as Gaddafi or Assad or Saddam. It's better to have them in place than to allow the region to descend into chaos. But their hatred of Israel, their deranged hatred of Israel, is so severe, so determined, that they don't care about destabilizing the region by having Israel gone and having Hamas win.
I've been raised the silence of Chion Mora and these Labour MPs on the question of Palestine. And we should be clear, they have not been silent. They have been very vocal in their condemnation of the Palestinian resistance. In October, Chion Mora came out and parroted the usual line, the condemnation of Hamas, banging on about the hostages and that Israel has a right to defend itself. This is the position of the Labour Party, thoroughly against the right of the Palestinians to resist. And it is one echoed by Chion Mora. It is one that she has echoed, sending messages into protests, condemning the resistance over the years. We have to take a stand against the Labour Party, which is a thoroughly pro-Zionist party. It supported the implementation of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which makes it an offence to say that Israel is a necessarily racist endeavour. Well, we have to be clear that it is. It's built on the ethnic cleansing and the dispossession of the Palestinian people. The Labour Party is a thoroughly racist party.
So, as you're probably aware, in the UK, Hamas are a prescribed terrorist organisation.
Yes.
And that means if you air support for them, you're a criminal under UK law.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Is that unfair? Does that kind of silence people's voices?
It's very unfair, and my plaque says it all. Where you have repression, you will have resistance, and that's why Hamas came into play. They're not a terrorist organisation.
Do you think the fact that Hamas are a prescribed terrorist organisation, do you think that kind of like muzzles people from saying what they want to say?
Definitely. I think that Hamas is a legitimate resistance organisation in the same way that the Maquis were a French resistance organisation against the Nazis during the Second World War. So labelling any organisation that you happen not to like as terrorist is just a trick which most governments use.
Do you think if you were Gazan you might join Hamas?
Probably, yes.
Zionists, they are filthy animals.
What was your reaction on the 7th of October when Hamas invaded Israel? What was your reaction on the 7th of October when Hamas invaded Israel?
That it has been so long that they've been suffering that, I mean, it was the only way. They couldn't find any other way just to show that they needed to do something to show the world that we need to support their cause.
Let me tell you about Hamas. I am bloody glad they have woken up and fought the resistance they should have done 70 years ago.
And there we have it. There we have it. Perfect. Here you have, Jab, a man on national radio in this country supporting a prescribed terrorist organisation who murdered men, women and children. And you think I've got the problem?
Yes.
They don't care about the fact that, all the Jews in Israel are going to have to flee or be slaughtered if Hamas win. And where are the Jews going to come to? They're going to come to a Europe that is rampant with anti-Semitism now. And Israel is running out of time to get this done, and the pressure is on them to get this done quickly. And this is a careful operation. You can't, as much as I want this to be won quickly, it can't be won quickly. And that's what the left want, and they can't be allowed to do this.
I say if Hamas, which is responsible for the killings of 36 children on October 7th, should not stay in power, then you must certainly agree, peers, and I'm going to kindly ask you to please answer me. You must surely agree then that Israel, which has killed now approximately 12,000 children and is plausibly accused of having killed them in the course of a genocide. You said that Hamas disqualified itself from leadership because of the atrocity that was committed, or atrocities that were committed October 7th.
Yes.
Now, if you agree with the head of the National Security Council of Israel at the time in 2004, that Hamas is a huge concentration camp. I'm quoting him now.
Gaza, you mean?
Would you also agree that October 7th was a reaction to confining 1 million children in a concentration camp?
He repeatedly in that interview referred to Gaza as a concentration camp. Gaza is no such thing as a concentration camp, and Norman Finkelstein knows that very, very well. Every single Jew was removed from Gaza forcibly in 2005 by the Israeli government. In 2006, the people of Gaza had an election and they elected Hamas. Hamas proceeded to kill Fatah and other Palestinians who did not agree with Hamas. And if anyone is responsible for making Gaza into a prison camp, it is Hamas that uses places like the Shifa hospital as torture chambers for Palestinians. Now, here's another oddity about it. He kept saying concentration camp about Gaza. Do you, Piers, know anybody who got out of a concentration camp in 1945 and proceeded to go next door and behead and rape everyone they could find? I don't. But only Norman Finkelstein finds these kinds of comparisons to make and makes them willfully. All societies produce sick individuals, but very few people have been produced who are quite as sick as Norman Finkelstein.
And the worst thing in all this is the fact that they were willing to use October the 7th as their cudgel to do it. As their cudgel to say, well, there's an attack that's going to make Israel overreact, and now we've got to be vigilant to how much they're overreacting so we can press home this case against Israel and have them ruined as a country.
And I am 100% 10 toes down anti-Israel. I believe Israel has no right to exist. I believe the United States has no right to exist. I believe every settler colony who has committed genocide against native peoples, against indigenous people, has no right to exist. I believe in a free Palestine. From the river to the sea. Y'all are the demons. Y'all are the villains. We've been trying to end y'all. Get free of y'all.
And I never knew this left were that sick and deranged. Were that cheap and willing to exploit a horror like October the 7th to get their victory. There's nothing too low for the left. Now, there is a darkness to Zionism. There was a darkness to Zionism, and we saw it with the Nakba back in 1948. It was the end goal of Zionism to cleanse a region and just make it an exclusively Jewish supremacist country. You know, that was tied to the Holy Land. It was devious, it was dark. And it was long in the planning, apparently. But once Israel became a democracy, and once it, had to adhere to punitive UN resolutions, that I would say got dialed down. It got kept in check, and we had a Israeli population who, up until October the 7th, were behind the idea of a peaceful resolution. Most of those people who believed in peace were massacred on October the 7th. Those are the people that were disproportionately massacred by Hamas.
I can't stress enough that people in the kibbutz, people in these communities, you see even on the remainders of their house, on their fridge magnets, peace now, live and let live. These were people who wanted to live by their Gazan neighbors. And often cooperated, drove people to hospital. There's a funeral today of an 80-year-old woman who drove Palestinian children to hospitals. She was an Israeli. She was killed by Hamas. Her funeral is today. They couldn't identify the body until just a few days ago. She was so badly burned. People like that man you just saw me interviewing, he said to me at the end of our interview, he said, I'm a leftist. I've always been a leftist. He said, we cannot live beside these people, by which he and all the others mean we cannot live beside Hamas.
They were left-wing. And they weren't to know that our left-wing in Britain and America and France would happily dance on their graves. And did indeed dance on their graves.
Are you people dead? Are you people dead? Yes. Oh, good. Good. Are they dead? Oh, good.
But the thing is, if there is a darkness in Zionism, just as there is darkness in most things, there's a darkness in the right wing, there's a darkness in the left wing, there's a darkness in Islam. There's more of a darkness in Islam than in Zionism, I would say. And we're seeing it very kind of transparently these days. But it's being assisted by a darkness on the left that is also long-term planning. I'm inclined to think that anti-Zionism, there's far more darkness in anti-Zionism than in Zionism. And the consequences of their goals will be far more horrific than anything else for the world over. Because if Islamic terror wins, if Hamas win, if Islamic terrorism wins, and Israel as one of the few stabilizing nations in that region goes, this world is fucked. And it's fucked because of the sick darkness that exists on the left. I had no idea it was there all along.
I'm so fed up of the double standards on all of this. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Muslims have been killed in the last 12 years by Bashar al-Assad and other Muslims in the civil war in Syria. There's no one on the streets of Sydney or Melbourne. There's no one on the streets of London. We have seen hundreds of thousands of people killed in the last decade in Yemen, Muslims being killed. There's no one on the streets of Melbourne. Nobody is standing outside the Sydney Opera House calling gas the Hutu, or gas the Houthi, gas the Shia, gas the... Nobody's marching for the dead Muslims in Yemen. Their co-religionists, we're always told about, care so much about their co-religionists, don't give a damn about their co-religionists. They really don't. They have no love for the Palestinian peoples. None. If they had any, the Jordanians would have taken in the West Bank Palestinians, the Egyptians would have taken in the territory they used to run, the Gaza, and own the Gaza, and they would have taken in the Palestinians from the Gaza. Why have the Egyptians made sure that not one Palestinian is allowed to leave Gaza? Why do they make sure that their border wall is tough as anything? What do they mind? One thing: Jews living. Jews living and Jews winning. It hits them deep in their soul, in their psyche. It's an ancient, ancient hatred.